Hey gamers, this is Liz Davidson from Beyond Solitaire, and welcome back to the Beyond Solitaire podcast. This week's special guest is Taylor Schuss, a game designer who is designing a game about Stonewall. How are you, Taylor?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing, Liz?
I'm doing great, and I'm delighted to be talking with you. So why don't you give us the lowdown on your game? Give us the basics.
So, Stonewall Uprising is the current name. It's not signed right now, so things could change. Fair. Is a two-player game where one player plays as the man and one player plays as Pride, fighting for the struggle over gay civil rights from 1960 to 1989. It plays in about 45 to 60 minutes currently, and it's a two-player deck building game actually, where you're fighting over things like the Overton window, and you're kind of going over the history of it, one step at a time through each of the 3 decades that the game encompasses. So it's there's a lot going on. It's not like a wildly complex game by any means. I mean, it's a deck builder, so if you're familiar with that, you kind of get what's going on. But you play one card at a time, and you're fighting over 3 tracks: public opinion, individual support, and systemic support. And the Pride player's goal is to shift the Overton window down to a certain point, to where they can roll their dice pool equal to or above that. And their dice pool is indicative of protests, riots, demonstrations, etc. And then the man's goal is to detain and then demoralize 10 or more people from the Pride player's deck to set the movement back a number of years. And that's kind of the bare basics of how the game works. I'm sure I could go into a lot more, but that's kind of the core premise. And each decade, an event happens and your markets shift. And so suddenly there's new cards to buy that are indicative of what happens, not just in the 60s, but also the 70s and to the 80s as well.
So what inspired you to design this particular game?
Well, a lot of the games I work on are pretty unthematic. I mean, I don't want to go into details there, but a lot of them are more your standard stuff with cubes and contracts and Euro games and all that nonsense. But this one, so 2 or so years back, I was working on a game where there's a shifting area that players can work in, right? And basically it shifts and it slowly goes to the end. It's kind of like a fancy round tracker, but it also mechanically says, hey, here's the active zone you can work in, and it's going to shift over the course of the game. And when I was trying to figure out a good theme for the game, because it was about terraforming, and I don't know, it wasn't especially exciting. And so I was brainstorming themes for this game with some friends and just among myself too. And I was thinking about great migrations, because you're shifting over this landscape over the course of the game. And I was like, oh, well, what if this was a game about, the Mongols over Europe, or even like Moses traveling with his people, this great exodus. And then I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting, but I don't know if that's really my story to tell. It seems ambitious, and there's a lot of homework I'd have to do to make sure I got that right. And then I thought, well, what kind of theme could I do that other people might not be able to do? And that's so I thought of Stonewall. And then that kind of sat in my head for like a year or two. Kind of sat in there, just percolating, kind of drip one at a time. And then during COVID, I think probably around April, I was taking a walk, and I realized that I may have come up with a good mechanism to pair with the theme, because that's what I'd kind of been waiting for, right? I didn't want to jump into the game willy-nilly and then just kind of faff about. So what I did was, I tried out this mechanism, which was using the core concept of actually MOBAs, with its 3 lanes. If you're unfamiliar, MOBA video games, they're lane-based games, and there's 3 lanes, and you might push up on one, but then your opponent pushes up on the other. And I really like that as a core balancing act, right? You can't just keep focusing on one. You have to kind of diversify your threats, or you can focus on one, but they're going to be able to nail you on the other 2. And so I realized that if that could make sense thematically to the way the struggle was fought, so to speak. Again, fighting is mostly an abstraction, although it definitely did happen. Um, maybe the game could work. And then I did a lot of reading before I did anything else. And then my preliminary tests were like, wow, this game kind of does work. Like, there's a lot of things I had to twist and turn and whatnot, but it started to come together, and my playtesters starting to really enjoy it. So that was a great sign, and that's kind of the genesis of the game, so to speak.
Fantastic. What made you decide to go for sort of an abstract pride versus the man structure? What led you to kind of go that abstract with it?
Well, one of the first ideas I had when I was brainstorming a game about Stonewall Uprising as a movement was what I would argue is the most bare bones answer to a game like this, which is like a cooperative game where you're all playing as queer youth during the actual Stonewall riots or uprising, depending on what people call it. And I thought that was fine. I'm not a big co-op gamer. I'm not. Like, they're fine. I mean, I like the mind quite a bit, and I really need to play the crew. But a lot of the ones that don't use limited communication tend to fall a little flat for me. I mean, they're good games. They're just not for me. And so I realized that's not where I wanted to go because I knew it probably wasn't going to hold my attention. And so if it's not a cooperative game and it's going to be about, the Stonewall riots or a larger part of that and that's just one piece of the story, who's your antagonist, right? What are you fighting against? And so it seemed pretty obvious that I could use a more structural demand, which is supposed to be like a little tongue in cheek, like it's not the most serious name on purpose, as your antagonist, and it's more emblematic of all these structures and things in the way, prejudices that people held, and some do still hold for sure, of what you're fighting against. And there I was like, okay, well now I have an antagonist, but this needs to be like a 2-player game. You can't you can't have some weird neutral third party involved. It doesn't really work. And that's kind of how the core structure came about. I will say, This Guilty Land by Tom Russell was a pretty big inspiration for the game as a base structure, where it's a two sides, kind of fighting over this thing. There's shits on a map. I mean, my game doesn't really have a map, but the core structure of This Guilty Land was really helpful in envisioning what this game was going to be, and a lot of that stuck out towards the end. It didn't, that was very necessary, I think, to visualize it immediately, and also to think about how it could be very abstracted while still being visible on a game board.
What kind of feelings or maybe even discomfort would you expect somebody playing the man to have? I mean, obviously, if you're picking up a game called Stonewall Uprising, probably you yourself are not the man. And so, how
Fair.
did you build that experience to be something? Is it meant to be fun? Is it meant to be emotionally challenging? How do you balance the demands of a game versus the seriousness of the historical theme?
Sure. So for me, I will say that I really tried to make sure that I found verbiage really helped a lot, right? So when I want to jump into this, right? So when I say the man's goal is to detain and then demoralize 10 people, that verbiage is deliberately constructed to make players feel a certain way, right? But what's interesting is if you look at it mechanically, detaining cards is taking cards out of the Pride player's discard pile or deck, right? So I mean, if you wanted to really keep it mechanical, you could say, "Oh, that's just deck thinning," right?
Hmm.
And it is. It is deck thinning. And then demoralizing is just taking from that pile and putting them into another one. But because I've deliberately called them people, I wanted to make players understand what they were doing. Right, you're taking these people out of the movement and you're setting them aside. You're probably putting them in jail or something, something like that, or making them feel bad about themselves for who they are and the movement they're going for. And I'll definitely say that the game is a good game for sure. But it also it's supposed to make the man feel a specific way. Depending on who you are, of course. There's no one way a game can make you feel. There's no just like, oh yeah, you always feel X at Y time. But typically, I would say the 60s and 70s, the man feels a little upset with themselves for sure over the course of that period. You know, you're playing cards that have hate groups on them and have, you know, pretty terrible images. I mean, I put historically accurate images on all the cards, even in my prototype, to really give players an understanding of what they were doing. I didn't want them to just be able to say, oh, well, you know, that's just the track I'm moving up on. I'm like, no, 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 there's a person. And I will note that the Pride side has people and individuals on their cards. The man has none of that. The man does not have individuals who stick around for the whole like 30 years or 29 years the game takes place. But Pride certainly does. Um, and that's something that I actually kind of thought was very interesting. Is there's no one figure that stays around the whole time for the man, not even remotely. Once they lose a certain fight or two, most people tend to move on to another battle. But if you were on the Pride side, that was your battle, you know. And it's pretty wild to me how many people stuck around. I mean, the whole time. It is doing my research. It was so interesting. But where it really hits the fan is once you hit the 80s, because with the 80s, that's when the AIDS crisis hits, which is in the game. I do not shy away from that. It's not fun, and I've had playtesters say they felt nauseous playing the game at that point. Now, I wouldn't say that's the most common, but I've definitely heard it said, and it is, it's definitely a different take on it, and it's definitely, a mechanic in the game. It's not complex by any means, but it's a mechanic that both players care about for different ways. And the fact that it's in there, and the fact that it's so upfront, and the fact that the man, really controls the pace of it, can definitely be jarring for people who aren't sure what to expect there. But it definitely can be uncomfortable, and ideally, it's somewhat uncomfortable while still being good game design. It's not just, oh, I'm making you uncomfortable, my game's inherently good. It's, oh, my game's making you uncomfortable and the game is good. That's the hope.
Right. So, I want to win because I'm playing a game, but also, let me think about myself.
Yeah.
Depending on which
Yes,
side.
exactly.
What made you choose the specific range of years that you did?
Well, so the game started when I first made it from 1960 to 1969, or or 1970 kind of, because I thought that it would make sense if it was just the 60s, and then it would end with Stonewall, and then your win condition as Pride is to hit the Pride parades, because in my opinion, the Pride parades were actually the big thing. Stonewall, this is my personal opinion. I want to know, this is not like, I'm not a historian. Stonewall was going to happen no matter what. It just happened to be then and there. But the Pride parades were the big part because they were the follow up. They were the 1 year anniversary of Stonewall. And so that's what really kept gradually progressing with public opinion and getting people to notice and realizing they had friends who maybe weren't straight. And for me, that's where things really started to snowball. Right? It wasn't that we fought off the cops or whatever. It was having a consistent, regular reminder that we're people too. I know it doesn't sound wild now, but at the time, when Stonewall happened, most people weren't even sure what being a homosexual or anything like that was. Right?
Yeah.
And so originally that made sense, but as I was going through playtesting, the game felt a little stagnant. I'll put it. And it definitely wanted some more meat on it. And designing new cards wasn't hard. I had ideas for other mechanics. So I thought to myself, how do I do this? And I got a chance to playtest the game in mid to late June, if I recall, with Dan Thurrow, Space Biff. And he mentioned how, I don't know if this is already in my head. I don't remember the exact timeline, but he was like, well, I want the market to progress. I want there to be, a little more going on. And so after I hear that feedback from him and some others for sure, I decided to expand it 2 decades ahead. 3 decades is a nice amount, and it hits a lot of the major points where it's like the beginning of the civil rights movement for the queer advocates. Then you have the middle where it starts to really get to a head, and then you have this really dramatic final act where things get really bad. And from a narrative point of view, that works pretty well. From a historical point of view, it's very sad. Like, it's very upsetting. Like, reading and doing all that research, I would not call the most fun. But it leads to a somewhat 3-act structure, kind of. And also, there's not a lot else going on past that that's wildly new. Once you hit the 90s, I mean, age stats only get way worse. I mean, in the 80s, it's tame by comparison. And I don't have to expand on that much. I can just say, like, all right, that happens, you know. Um, and I don't want to get too close to modern history to now, because where the game lives is in the settled history where there's no argument. People aren't going to, like, write me long for. I'm sure this might happen, but you know they're less likely to write me these long, you know, forum posts about why the history is all dead wrong. Where if it happens now, there's still dispute, and you know, people are gonna view it in more partisan ways. Whereas, you know, it starts in the '60s and ends in the late '80s. That's it's fairly old news. Which I kind of like. It means I can read a history book and kind of trust it.
Fair enough. So, what you say you're not a historian, but clearly you've done a lot of historical research. What events did you feel it was most important to bring into your game and that you want people who play it to walk away with some knowledge of that they might not have had before?
I mean, I think for me, the most interesting parts of history and the parts that I wanted to shine a light on were pre-Stonewall events. Those were probably the parts that I had the most interest in, because most people, if you know about Stonewall, you know about, you know, Stonewall and then Pride Parade, and then like the '70s happen and it gets pretty wild, right? Most people know that stuff, I would say, or at least they know bits and pieces of it. Um, but pre-Stonewall, I mean, there were groups and groups who were beginning to do advocacy, and not just in New York, um, although primarily in New York and San Francisco, to be sure. And for me, that stuff was really interesting. And that's why when you start the game, each side has a starter deck, and they're all historical people and groups and ideas, um, that are emblematic of, you know, prior to Stonewall. These are all things that have already happened, some of which all the way back in like the '50s. You know, the man has a card with McCarthy on it, for crying out loud.
Ooh.
I mean, you know, and that card detains someone. Oh wow, I can't figure out the historical context there, except the flavor text of the card mentions McCarthyism and how it disproportionately targeted gays. Um, you know, and that to me is not really in the game, but it's like I can kind of cheat and like kind of sneak it in there, because it is part of the history of how people are being systemically disenfranchised, right? For sure. And then a lot of the other stuff, you know, the '70s is kind of awkward to do a ton of research into, because Stonewall gets all this talk, and then the AIDS crisis happens, and people know that. Although reading the timelines is so upsetting. Oh my gosh. Um, but the actual mid '70s, there's so much that happens, and so I stuck to, um, you know, obviously there's like Harvey Milk and all that, and the White Night riots, which are in the game. But then you have people like Gilbert Baker, who designed the Pride flag. Um, and he designed it as a piece of activism, and he decided on purpose not to copyright it. He made a very specific point to make it that anyone could use it for anything. And I think that bringing a light to that, you know, is helpful. But yeah, I think, to really answer your question succinctly instead of talking in circles, as I might be prone to do, is is the pre Stonewall stuff was the stuff that I thought was interesting to shine a light on, because it's stuff that not many people talk about. It's the things that aren't focused on, and I think it's worth talking about, because people feel like they start the queer history book right there at Stonewall, and that is not true. It is not true at all. Sip-ins were happening, demonstrations were happening. The Daughters of Bilitis had already been a thing for a while. Same with the Madison Society. I mean, they were around, and there were, you know, there was a totally gay bookstore in New York, and they told the guy who started running it, they're like, look, the Madison Society is like, look, you know, this is a bad idea. You're going to get hate mail, and you're going to get, you know, threats and all this stuff. And the guy's like, you know, apparently I'm more extreme than you are for wanting to start a bookstore, which by modern comparison is wild to hear about. but but at the time it makes sense, and like and you know, to their credit, on some level, the guy was attacked and his windows were broken over and over. But he kept going for quite some time. It was called the Oscar Wilde Memorial Bookstore, if I recall. And, you know, things like that are in the game, because it didn't just start in 1969. You know, that's a whole decade.
Wow. How much flavor text did you decide to put on your cards. A lot of the things you're mentioning, some of the things I know, some of the figures and groups I really, really don't. And how much education are you trying to do through the cards? Or is it something where if I'm intrigued by something, I might end up going to find out what it is later?
So my hope is that it's more of the latter. I definitely want to add in facts and tidbits and stuff so that players can be like, oh, I didn't know that. Like that, like that Jose Sarria in the '60s was one of the first, openly gay people to run for elected office in San Francisco. You know, and he had a decent sized voting block. You'd be surprised. Way before Harvey Milk, like a decade before all that stuff. Wild, right? Stuff that almost nobody talks about. Just because it never really quite materialized in the way that a better narrative like Harvey Milk has. Not to say he didn't do a lot, but it also helps that his story is quite compelling.
Right.
Um, and so for me, I tried to make it so people would read something and be like, "Oh, I want to look that up." And I will say, I've mainly playtested the game online, which makes it harder to just glance at the bottom of a card. That's a weird issue with playtesting stuff online. But the way I like to think of it is, I haven't, I own a few historical games that I've played, but the one that I've probably researched the most, and this is not much, but I still looked into it, which is impressive, is An Infamous Traffic by Cole Worley, published by Hollandspiel. And Infamous Traffic, there's these tokens you can draft, and they take police actions, but one of them has a name. One of them, and I know I'm butchering this name, but it's like Linzexi or something, or Linzexu. And Linzexu, I was playing a game of Infamous Traffic, and that tile just destroyed my entire plan. A player took an action and just ruined my day. And so I get home that night, and I'm like, I'm so angry at this tile. I'm gonna look him up. Who is this person? I need to know more. And that's part of my hope, right? Is that someone has a memorable experience with a part of the game, and they go home and do some research on it. Um, and for me, that's like my memorable moment with a game. And it's the only token that's named, which I always find very funny. um, but yeah, like I want to promote people to look into the stuff if they want to, but you could just keep it in the box and enjoy it that way too. That's totally fine. But it's not like a whole textbook below it. I try to keep it to a sentence or two at most. I don't always succeed there because I find a lot of the stuff interesting, but I'm hoping that I can keep, a fair amount of that with the game if a publisher ends up picking it up.
Fantastic. If people are interested in researching some of this now and are, awaiting your game with bated breath, what is the most accessible book that you came across that you would recommend that other people read if they want to get a sense of the history of the Pride movement?
I think looking over at the books that I looked at, and I want to note that I didn't just look at books. I also watched a few documentaries as well. I found those really accessible, just because you can kind of put them on. Books you have to sit down and really focus on. Documentary you can mostly focus on. At least I find. But Stonewall by David Carter was probably the one book that I'd recommend. And then there was a documentary that I found. Let me double check. I know this thing's name because if I get it wrong, I'll be really upset. But there's a documentary that was made in the '70s, this is where it gets really interesting because it wasn't just made in retrospect. It wasn't just made on a lark. It was actually made during the time, and I think that's what makes it so compelling for me. Because it's made in the moment, and these are all real candid interviews, and you can hear these are all recorded in like the mid '70s. You can see things are going along, things are chugging along, but it's still so scary for these people. And then it's wild because you play a game like mine, or you read research, and you start to recognize their names, and you're like, oh, these weren't just random people. They were also people in the movement too, and it's a great mix of people who you might not know anything about. And it's, to me, it was a really good resource because it really humanized the conflict in ways that more than a book does, if that makes sense. See if I can find the name of this documentary because I quite liked it, and I definitely Found it super helpful. It was called. I know you're here. You can't hide from me. Word is out. There you go. And it was wild. There was an address at the end of the documentary, the credits that they hold for a while, and because it was in theaters and eventually ended up on national television, if you'd believe it, um, their inbox got flooded with letters of people saying this is the first time any piece of media has ever showed us in a positive light, and I just for the first time I feel accepted. I feel like I'm being portrayed, and I watched it. It was a good documentary. I was very impressed by it, and I was really happy to found the resource thanks to a friend of mine who knows more about movies than I do.
So it's called Word is Out.
Yes, word is out.
All right. So you mentioned when you're talking about this documentary that you felt that it was humanizing in a way that reading about this period in time might not be. Do you also feel that that is something that your game is going to be able to do?
That's tough. I feel like part of the reason for me the documentary worked at humanizing them is because you can see them and hear their voices and like see their expressions. My game might be able to do that for some people, but I can't I can't say that knowingly. I can't know how someone's going to feel playing the game, because it's going to have a different experience on everyone, right? Whether you're playing Pride First of the Man, or whether you play it in a specific way or not, right? There's different ways to play it because it's a game. You have agency, you have decisions to make. It's not just, oh, here's how the game always goes. You can make mistakes, and the other player may or may not punish you for those mistakes. I mean, it's a two-player game. It can get, I wouldn't say the most mean, but it can get mean. It's not a game where it's just about pushing cubes up and down a track and being nice to each other and holding hands. It's not that kind of game.
One
I don't mind games like that, but this is not one of them.
one thing I did notice about your language though is that if the Pride side loses, it's not Pride is over forever. It's that the movement is delayed. Was that a deliberate choice on your part to make it less depressing, or is it a statement about how the way you think the history and culture are going?
It's a statement. It's a statement of how I think things are gonna inevitably go, especially in a place as individualistic as America. I think I'm not saying other places can't have this happen, but because like the "let me live my life" argument is so strong and hard to argue with, I just think it's inevitable, right? And if that argument works where you live, I think it's inevitable. And I do think it's inevitable at a more larger scale, but um, I think there's almost no way that it's gonna not work given time and maturity, so to speak. It's not even just like oh, I want publishers to like my game, so I'm gonna make it a little more optimistic. No, that's been in the rule book in every draft of it. Because it's always been part of my vision. I've jokingly described the game as opti-prop, because I know that Tom Russell describes some of his games as agitprop. And so I'm like, well, my game is a lot more optimistic, uh, in some ways. So I'm very much about, I very much think it's a more positive view, than some people have had. But I also didn't live through all that, so I'll concede that's my point of view. But it's just my opinion.
I find it really interesting that you describe your view of the game as optimistic, but you also mentioned that a lot of aspects of this game are absolutely brutal and covering really difficult parts of history. We also skipped now, where we had a Supreme Court ruling legalizing gay marriage. Do you feel that things really are moving in a? Do you feel optimistic right now?
In a lot of ways, I would say yes. Yeah, I mean, I understand that it's easy to look at what's happening and feel very gloomy about it, so to speak. But I also feel like, in general, and again, I live in Southern California, right? So do I live in some sort of bubble? Yeah, yeah, yes, no argument there. But from my point of view, you know, people people have been fairly accepting, even just about the game, like as a baseline, about what's going on. Even people I wouldn't expect, um, and I think it's something that people can identify as once they realize it's just like, oh, we're fighting for our rights. And they're like, oh yeah, okay, cool. you know, and especially because it's so far from the history, it works. For now, I think we are trending in a positive direction. It's a very slow and steady wins the race kind of argument. It's forcing acceptance can be really wrought, um, and if done poorly, it can wreck some stuff up for sure. But I do think that things are going the right direction. I think that gay marriage, you know, was a long time coming in a lot of ways, but happened relatively speaking very quickly in accordance with historical norms, to my understanding. So I think it's actually kind of amazing how fast that happened, and it's kind of inspiring because it's like boom, it wasn't a discussion, like gosh, 10, 15 years before it happened, and then wow, it just hey. So I do think it's trending in a positive direction, and I understand where people might disagree. I don't blame you. you know this this isn't like some argument I'm trying to get into or anything, but this is just my opinion.
That makes sense. As a teacher, I have to feel hopeful because I teach kids. They're our future, and I really want a beautiful one for them. But also,
Yeah.
I truly feel that between when I was in school and now with my students, I think that at least young people today are so accepting that they would be shocked by some of the events that are happening in your game.
Oh yeah. Oh, for sure. I don't disagree with that at all. Um, and I hope, in a weird way, I hope that stays the same, because I don't want anyone to experience the horrifying things that happen. Right. I mean, there are some really jarring pieces of imagery I was able to pull from actual events, from groups marching on the Capitol. And you're like, wow, they were just there in public with torches? And I'm like, yeah, that really happened. Um, so, yes, I mean, terrible things happen in history, but that's the cool thing about history is we can reflect on it and be like, look how terrible that was. Good thing, that doesn't happen either anymore or not with the frequency that it did happen. I would like that to happen less. And I think that is happening, but it does take time and knowledge and experience, and especially with the queer community, so many people, once you come out, and not everyone has to come out. I understand there are circumstances. Of course, it's not just an easy like, oh, I'll rub the band-aid on it and pop, it's fixed. But once people know someone who they know is out or queer or what have you, that changes how people view it, and it definitely gives them some real perspective. And it's wild how the evidence just shows that so concretely. it's it's so funny to me how, like, the moment someone has that level of empathy, that natural empathy for a friend or loved one or family member, it's hard for them to argue against those kinds of people. It really is.
And so you expressed doubts about your game being able to humanize conflict, but I mean I haven't played it yet, but I actually wonder, the way that you talk about activists staying in the Pride deck over the course of the entire 30-year span of the game, the ability to get attached to people who get demoralized on the side of Pride, do you see your game as a contribution to that? I mean, in the end?
Um, so I'll put it this way: I view my game as a piece of media that talks about um the struggles in the Pride movement as a historical point of view. But I don't think it's saying anything wild, and I don't think it's if you're aware of the history, I don't think it's going to shock you. I'll put it that way. But I do see it as a contribution in that regard.
Mhm.
Um, I but again, if you're well read up on the history, I don't think it's going to really shock you. I think it's just going to be, oh yeah, that happened. But how is it going to work in a game? I think that's going to be the big question for a lot of people, and I totally understand that. It took a while to get a lot of it to feel like it worked, and of course, a fair amount is abstracted. It is a game. I can't just, you know, there's not like there's not a track for each event that happens. That'd be ridiculous. That would just be so much to do. It's not a consim or anything. It's a very abstracted kind of struggle for what's going on. Um, but I mean, yeah, I definitely see it as a contribution to the work of media around the topic, and it really shocked me when I learned there were no other games that cover the topic at all. And I don't mean like I mean, sure, there's probably references here or there in other games, but I mean, I did some searching initially just to check, just to take a look. I always like to when I work on games to make sure no one's using the same theme I am, or if it is, at least it's in a different way. No other games have had this topic. Zero, zilch, zilch, nada.
Wow.
Like that's so wild to me.
But that makes this one all the more exciting. So you've designed games in the past, but this is your very first historical game. Did you find the process of designing a historical game different from other games that you've designed? Would you do it again? Did you like it?
Yeah. So most of the games I work on tend to be more abstract or start off as pretty themeless, like mechanisms. I'm definitely a mechanism first designer, and this game, because I had the idea for the theme for so long and just kind of sat on it, so I had the right way for it to work. It definitely was very different because one of the things is most of my games I'll just like paste the theme on. I'm like, I don't know, it kind of works. I'm like, the red cube gives you 5 points. Why? I don't know. It's the red cube. It'll make sense later. Whereas for Stonewall, I knew I had to hit it right off the bat. It had to be accurate and right. So before I even made a prototype, right, I had the idea in my head, but I let it percolate. I ordered books, I watched documentaries, I did a lot of research before I even made a prototype, which is very rare for me. But it made sense because if I wanted to get people invested and get them to understand what was happening in the game, I knew it couldn't just be like, oh, this card is worth 2 red points and red points. And I'm like, no. You have to understand what this has to be like public opinion. Public opinion has to be defined in these ways for players to grasp or grok what it means, not only mechanically, but more importantly, thematically. And so by making sure those work together from the very first draft, it really solidified that connection. And I worry because my game on some level is like you're kind of playing tug of war on 3 separate tracks, right? That's kind of how the game plays, and I worry that players will feel like it's unthematic in a lot of ways. But I've never had any playtester ever tell me that ever, which is wild to me. And I think that's just a testament to how integrated it feels and how because it was always there, it feels so just seeped in it. It's like marinated in the historical underpinnings and trappings of the time, right?
Yeah.
So and that's not the case for most of my games. Most of my games do not do that, and like I eventually figure out a theme. But Stonewall was a lot different in that regard, and I'm pretty happy with the product where it stands now.
Excellent. So, lighter question towards the end. What are you playing right now that you're enjoying?
I mean, it's funny because I've been doing so much playing online. Most of my games are playtesting with designer buddies and friends and all that. That's typically what I'm doing. What games am I enjoying? I mean, recently I played Cosmic Frog, which I really enjoyed. It was very chaotic in a way that I was expecting. And like the first third of the game, I just got punched in the gut by the game. It's very funny. But by the end, I had a very close score, and I felt like a real contender. And there are a few other games I'm very excited to try. Like I have a physical copy of The Cost. I just desperately want to get to the table, but I of course can't. I know it's online digitally, but that takes so much more time typically. And then I've been playing a few other classic games that I don't own, but I've been able to play, like Raw, that have been so much fun, and a few other lighter games, relatively lighter, like Quacks. There's a lot of games that I like to play. There's very few like genres or styles that I don't play with some regularity. But there's nothing that really like. Yeah, I think Cosmic Frog is probably the biggest one. That was really fun. That's a game I want to play more often. It's so wild. That game is so wild.
And so, where can we find you online and or your game?
So right now my game is unsigned. And if that changes, I'll be sure to notify people. The place where people can most find me is at Twitter. If you type in Taylor Schuss, you should find me right away. My tag or handle or whatever is at Drawn Onward, which I know is not the easiest thing to remember, but I'm sure someone can find it. The real secret is that it's a palindrome. So if you can spell the first half, you could spell the second half. Is the real secret behind it. And I'm on there pretty regularly. I talk about design stuff, and if there's any notifications, if there's any updates on the game or any of my games, I will definitely let people know and keep them informed.
Fantastic. I will be personally waiting with great excitement, even if it doesn't solo. How could you? Uh,
Yeah, that's come up a few times. It only plays at 2 right now, but there's definitely been talk about like how could a solo mode work, and that's a tall ask. But at least unlike some solo games, there's a clear answer for like what side you'd want to play. Right? It's not like, oh, how do I make a solo mode for both sides? It's like, oh, okay, I can kind of just skip that and say, how do I make a Pride solo mode? And that's kind of relaxing, I think. Like, who's gonna want to solo the man? I don't think that's a large audience.
yeah, I can't say that I have a distinct interest in that.
Yeah, and so it's kind of relaxing in a weird way where I don't feel like I have to worry about that because that's just not something I anticipate people wanting.
Fair enough. And as usual, y'all can find me anywhere on the internet as Beyond Solitaire. Taylor, thank you so much for your time. I'm so excited about your game, and I really appreciate you giving us some advanced insight into it.
I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, and it was really fun. This was super super so fun. Oh my gosh.
Have a good night, all of you listeners, and happy gaming.